The first session is Historical Issues in Northeast Asia, Perspectives from Law and Policy. And we have four distinguished panelists and one distinguished discussant. Their bios are in your packet just behind the schedule for the conference, so you can read them there. I will just introduce them to you here very briefly. To my immediate left is Professor David Kang, who is director of the Korean Studies Institute at the University of Southern California and a professor of international relations. Dr. John Perry, who's director of the Maritime Studies program at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Professor Paek Jin-hyun, who is a judge for the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, as well as a professor of law at Seoul National University. Michael Oslin, who is senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. And then the discussant for this panel is Dr. Kim Young-hwan, who is a research fellow with the Northeast Asian History Foundation. So we will go in the order of the folks as you see them on the panel. So our first presentation will be by Professor Kang. And you can come up here.
I'm gonna stand. Feel a little easier. Okay. Especially because I have a thing. Well, thank you very much, Victor, and the Northeast Asia History Forum for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. I did a conference with the Northeast Asia History Forum in Seoul last year, and I found it very illuminating. It's very interesting to bring all these different types of people together. So I think what you do is very useful, and I'm hoping here to be able to provide a little bit of more, I guess, framework or background than I had last year when it was much more specific types of things. So in a way, I apologize if I'm talking too much academic background, but in a way, I hope it'll be interesting. And I only have a couple of PowerPoint presentations. And the way I want to start out is by saying there was a great change in East Asia, as we all know, but we tend to forget about it. And I think these pictures are the most vivid way of presenting this, which is here is famous King Gojong, the last Korean king of the Joseon dynasty. I'm actually not sure when these pictures were taken, but here he is dressed in his traditional Korean hanbok. Korean pajamas. And then here he is, the same guy, a couple years later. And he looks like Otto von Bismarck with the mustache and the sword and the rack of medals, right? It's the same guy, and just to show it happened to everybody. Here is Taisho Emperor, again dressed in the traditional Japanese pajamas, and then the same guy a couple years later, right? Now, in a way, it almost looks like these guys are a caricature of themselves, trying to dress like Westerners when they're clearly not. But what I'm going to argue is that many, not all, but many of the ways that we think about historical issues today are informed by this great change that took place, which was a transition from a world order, an international system. Roughly, you could call it the Confucian international system, to a Western one. And that Confucian international system had its own internal logic. It had its own norms and institutions and rules. And it was actually quite stable and very long-lasting. Literally, for centuries, countries acted in a certain way. Now, the most interesting thing about the Confucian international system is that it was hegemonic, meaning, as we all know, China was considered the source of civilization. And it was hierarchic. There was a rank order based on how Confucian or how closely you were. So it's no surprise, as we all know, that Japanese, Koreans, and Vietnamese used Chinese characters as a sign of erudition and literature and learning. and they use Chinese literary forms and poetic forms, political institutions such as the civil exam service. Many of the ideas were taken from China. Even the Japanese, who were not necessarily happy with China being at the center, revered Chinese civilization, even if they looked down on the Chinese government or Chinese people themselves. And with the full arrival of the West in the 19th century, this international order just disappeared. It's gone. And everybody said, this isn't how we do international relations. This is how we do international relations. And overnight, they changed. Now, what's interesting about this transition is that today, nobody questions these rules, the Western rules, the Westphalian rules. And I'm going to come back to this when I talk about in my conclusion, and I'm going to try not to go very long. But this transition has led to a number of very interesting ways in which we now, in the 20th century, or the 21st century, began to view what the countries were and how they related to each other. Because there's a new set of rules, and particularly the Westphalian system is based on ideas of equality. And this is deeply embedded as a normative and institutional aspect of the Western system. Normatively, from French Enlightenment thinkers, Rousseau, John Locke in England, the U.S. Constitution, Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal. And it's certainly embedded institutionally in the idea that there's one set of countries, there's one set of political actors that's allowed to act, and that's nation states, and you either are in the club or you're not in the club. And if you're in the club, everybody's treated the same way. So it's equality as opposed to a rank order or a hierarchy. Now, one of the interesting things about this is that what we end up with then is today every country in the region began to rewrite their history based on these modern rules as opposed to the old Asian rules. Most particularly, and the thing I find most interesting is that many of us today take at face value these histories that were written in the 20th century for a very clear political purpose of elevating countries according to Western ideas and standards. So before, what was considered to be a huge achievement was to be considered high in the rank order, how close you could be towards some Chinese civilizational ideal. And in particular, both Korea and Vietnam were considered in their respective regions the top of the hierarchy because they were very, very similar to Chinese. Almost overnight, this got reinterpreted, where being in a hierarchy was considered to be a sign of weakness, of domination, of submission. And what had to be happened is we had to rewrite history to make it that we were equal to everybody else. Because to admit that you were number 2 or number 5 was a sign then that to Western countries that you probably didn't deserve to exist anymore. So Vietnam, and I have more stuff in my paper, but Vietnam, which literally for about 11 centuries was extremely close to China, rewrote their history overnight in the 20th century to emphasize the difference from China and how many wars they had fought, when the reality is they didn't fight very many wars at all against China. In Korea, the 13 centuries, perhaps, of close emulation and interaction with China, from Shilla, Koryo, Joseon dynasty, immediately we ignore all that. And Shin Chae-ho is probably the best example of this, who reached back 13 centuries to the Goguryeo dynasty, or the kingdom, to say, here's an example of when we were strong and powerful and masculine and everything else. And downplaying 13 centuries of very close emulation with China. Japan, of course, tried to situate itself as the most Western of the Asian countries, and I think we have plenty of other Japan experts here who will be talking about this, but finding a way to situate themselves as not really Chinese, not really in that hierarchy, in a way always an honorary Western country. So what we today take as face value as these histories, in many ways are a response in the last 100 years to a totally different set of rules and norms and institutions about how countries should interact. And in many ways, it's consequential. And this is just a larger way or a more background way of talking about how we end up with historical disputes in East Asia, because many of them are not actually historical disputes. They're contemporary disputes over whose side of the story gets told. Who gets to write the history and emphasize or downplay or ignore certain types of things in the past. And that's always happens. But in East Asia, it's particularly intensified because there's an entire set of rules and norms now that we didn't use more than perhaps 100, 150 years ago. So I'm going to give you an example of that, again, very briefly, when I talk about good fences make good neighbors from the Robert Frost thing. Because the difference, I ask my students this, and I say, what's the difference between a frontier and a border? And in this time, we won't do this here, right? But my quick answer is, a border is a line, and a frontier is a space. And my short one-sentence history of the world is, it's a process of turning frontiers into borders. And interestingly enough, in East Asia, when you had political units who had areas between them that were consequential, they negotiated them into borders that tended to be long-lasting and stable. Phenomenally long-lasting in comparison to Europe. When you had other types of frontiers, particularly maritime frontiers, that back then nobody cared about, they weren't delineated, and they remain a source of problem today. So, for example, Korea's northern border with China basically reached the Yalu by 1034. So literally 1,000 years, that has been the demarcation between Chinese kingdoms and Korean kingdoms. By the time of the Joseon dynasty, it had actually reached the Yalu and the Tumen rivers. And this part, Baekdusan, was negotiated in the 17th century. And that border has been stable for literally centuries upon centuries. Interestingly enough, the same thing in Vietnam. Lang Son has been the border between Vietnam and China since 1078 AD, when Sung and the Vietnamese dynasties negotiated that this is the border, and there was a great gate at Lang Son, and there was a south-holding frontier post and a ghost gate frontier post. And that's literally the same place where they negotiated the border in 1999. So again, about 1,000 years, that border's been stable. Other areas on the west, which were frontiers, were negotiated over time, and China expanded westward and the nomads kept retreating until they ran into the Russians coming south, and the nomads had nowhere left to go. Now, what's interesting about that is I used to live in New Hampshire, and in many ways, some of the borders are similar to the western demarcations. Because in New Hampshire, if you go, actually this is Vermont, right? But you can go, you drive on a freeway, you get off the freeway, you get on a side road, you go on a dirt road, the dirt road ends, you get out of your car, and you hack your way through the jungle, and then in the middle of nowhere is a little white post that says, here's where U.S. stops and Canada begins. Down to the inch, well, you know where it is. I mean, this is a very Western conception. The borders that mattered in East Asia were negotiated that way, but a lot of the other ones weren't. That was a different set of rules. The Western system tends to be more legalized, down to the inch. Here again we have Border Patrol, and you can see these little white posts literally in the middle of the forest there somewhere. It's really astonishing how this happened. And we start to get these types of rules in East Asia now for things that historically didn't matter, like a bunch of rocks in the middle of the ocean that nobody cared about before. They didn't think about those things. The only people who cared about them were the fishermen who wanted to avoid them. But nowadays, that matters because we need to get a bunch of frontiers down to borders everywhere. And that has been notoriously difficult to do. Particularly because we're using a different set of rules now, and nobody questions this at all. I think that's my last thing. Yeah, so I don't want to spend too much time, other than by way of conclusion for this. I think there are clearly many other historical issues that have to do with China-Japan or Korea-Japan relations in the 20th century. But the overall backdrop to this, I think, is a set of countries that had a really long history of interacting with themselves in one way. And then in the last 100, 150 years are learning to interact with each other another way. And so by way of conclusion, let me talk about first China, which I think is perhaps the most interesting, because everybody's worried about the rise of China. There's no way, nobody in China that I know of is planning for a return to the Chinese tributary system. I don't know a single Chinese who thinks that they're going to go back to wearing the Chinese pajamas and the long queue and everything else, right? I mean, Chinese have in many ways accepted the rules and norms of the Western international relations, perhaps more deeply than even Western countries right now. So things like national sovereignty, deciding on borders, and then those borders are fixed, and nobody has the right to change those borders. Chinese have a passport, right? These are all Western ideas that China has clearly accepted 100%. So my sense of how China is going to fit in on these historical things is going to be within the set of rules. It's not a fundamental challenge to the rules of the game. It's where is it going to fit in relation to the other countries within the current set of rules. Now, for other historical issues as well, this is a process of sorting out this transition. And there are many nationalist histories competing with each other in every one of these countries that looks back in time and, frankly, selectively chooses various types of issues, examples, etc., with which to make a case in present. But the problem is actually a political issue today as how countries are going to negotiate their relations with each other. It's actually not history. And somebody pointed out to me once, said, the problem with actually countries having a really long history is that there's examples, whatever you want, you can find an example to prove your case, right? You got 5,000 years or whatever of history, you can find something that'll fit. The U.S. has 200 years of history, and so we don't have quite as many examples. So this is actually much more of a background way of talking about these kind of historical issues. But it might be worth keeping in mind that there is a whole set of ideas, norms, and institutions that we in East Asia have transitioned to, and in many ways is the source of why there's such inability to rewrite the previous history under the different rules, now to rewrite it under the modern rules. This isn't an easy thing to do. So I hope I have been thought-provoking, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Victor. It's a privilege to be here for these discussions, and I'm looking forward very much to everything here, and we're off to a splendid beginning, I would say. My title is Northeast Asia in the context of general global maritime history, and it's a rather broad approach to the subject, but I think perhaps it would be useful to have some background. After all, the sea is the unifier, at least potentially, of the region. It defines it. The ocean really forms the common denominator of Northeast Asia, and it plays the role of avenue, arena, and source. Avenue for the flow of goods and resources, and traditionally, of course, for people and ideas as well, information. And it's an arena for struggle and combat, and now increasingly a source for minerals and foodstuffs, and perhaps much else that lies in the future. Now a frontier of opportunity, it's also a frontier of challenge. Can we exploit the resources of oceanic space without severely damaging the natural environment or inflaming national passions? So as a maritime historian, I would like to propose an overview of changing uses of the ocean in Northeast Asia, and I'm focusing on the period from the early 19th century to the present, casting these two centuries in terms of what I call Oceanic Revolution, a phenomenon that I see is unfolding in three major episodes, two of which happened during this period and one much earlier. Revolution may seem to be an overly used term, but in measure of how the ocean has been used, it seems apt. Without the drama of political revolution, but like the agricultural or industrial revolutions, Oceanic Revolution has unfolded in a protracted series of spasms of change that have reshaped the world. European initiatives brought about the first burst of Oceanic Revolution at the turn of the 15th century, when intrepid Atlantic navigators discovered the world wind system and used it to open global sea routes for their gunned sailing ships, thus establishing a stream of global interactions. The Atlantic world, unchallenged in its command of blue water space, then began to make its imprint on the societies of Northeast Asia and elsewhere. But Atlantic power at this time was limited to the range of seaborne cannon, and this was conventionally 3 miles and became the generally accepted determinant of national sovereignty over adjoining waters. Other powers rejected Spanish and Portuguese attempts to lay claim to ownership over global oceanic space, following the argument of the Hollander Hugo de Groot, known as Grotius, in proclaiming that the seas were open and common to all. Nonetheless, the North Atlantic powers coursing the world viewed the islands and coastal littorals that they found with a proprietary eye. Sailors and adventurers did not hesitate to attach their own names or identifications, usually English, to places that might have been known for centuries by other names locally. After 1815 and the British defeat of the French in what has been called the Second Hundred Years' War, the Royal Navy of Britain faced no challengers. What then should they do to combat what one captain called the canker of idleness? Arctic exploration offered one such purposeful activity. Chasing slavers and pirates was another. Northeast Asia lay outside the streams of slave traffic, which was largely Africa-centered. But the China coast was rife with piracy and had been for many centuries. Here the British made themselves useful, contributing to the security of seaborne trade flows, in which, of course, they had a very large interest. The Royal Navy busied itself in compiling surveys, sharing its findings with the public, both at home and abroad. Unlike other Europeans, the secretive Spaniards earlier, or the Russians as well. And during the last decades of the 18th century, Captain James Cook, in the spirit of the Enlightenment, set a precedent for publishing voluminous information about his series of remarkable Pacific voyages. And these volumes became bestsellers in the book market at that time. The British enjoyed strategic advantage in transporting troops to the 2 wars that they fought at mid-century with the Chinese. They could ferry their Indian troops freely up and down the China coast, and that advantage reminds us of the same advantage that the United States Navy had during the Korean War of 1950-1953, command of the sea. In Korean waters, Captain Edmund Pellew of the Royal Navy, in the course of a surveying expedition, sailed in the Komundo Lagoon in 1845 and named it Port Hamilton. The British did not ask for permission to land or for any special privileges there, either from the Koreans, who were then members of the Chinese tributary system, or the Chinese, nominally in charge of Korean foreign affairs. Resting on British maritime power, Britain's maritime law became the default law of the seas, and London arbitration was the accepted means of dispute resolution. The latter half of the 19th century saw a second major spasm of oceanic revolution, slower to evolve than the first, but equally profound in its impact. The steam engine offered new tactical mobility, making ships independent of wind and current, but carrying strategic liability by making ships newly dependent upon fuel supplies. And so the availability of coaling stations became a hot issue, especially for warships or for those who were planning to use them. Because Britain had an ample supply of coal and an empire with a global sprawl, the new technology of transport gave fresh advantage to the British, and others became newly interested in obtaining coaling stations at strategic intervals on the world's major sea routes. The steam-powered shallow draft gunboat, able to penetrate inland freshwater spaces, spread the tentacles of Atlantic presence and power globally, exposing hitherto untouchable territorial spaces to seaborne outsiders, thus establishing new vulnerabilities. China would be a leading example. Foreign warships routinely began to patrol the Yangtze River heartland of Imperial China, extending foreign authority and influence as the Qing state began its collapse into disintegration and demise. At about the same time, the electric undersea cable divorced transportation from communications for the first time in history. By 1871, the cable provided rapid transmission of news linking China to Britain, giving enormous commercial and political advantage to all those who were able to tap this new medium. And a global wired network would follow. Throughout much of the 19th century, Britain, as the world's greatest sea power, could dominate the world ocean and world politics. But as the century waned, the rapidly industrializing United States and Germany, joined by newly internationally active Japan, were beginning to emerge as strategic and commercial rivals, each carrying out territorial empires in East Asia. Japan in Taiwan and Korea, the United States in the Philippines, Germany in Shandong province, all of these made possible by the reach of sea power. But few then recognized that British primacy had reached its peak by 1914, the eve of World War I. Oil had begun to replace coal as the fuel of preference, thus putting Britain, having coal but lacking oil, at great economic and strategic disadvantage. The internal combustion engine brought diesel power to ship propulsion, but the British were slow to adopt it. After two great wars, in the latter part of the 20th century, the world moved into a third phase of oceanic revolution. Air power created a competitive new dimension, and in the naval sphere, the gun yielded to the missile, and nuclear propulsion created a new self-sufficiency providing both tactical and strategic freedom for warships. They could travel wherever, whenever, and however long they wished. And nuclear power made the first true submarines possible, with immense consequences, of course, to transport in the Arctic, for example. For the transport of resources and goods, the bulk carrier and the standard size steel box caused transportation costs to plummet. And this resulted in explosive growth of world trade and world wealth. Americans initiated these changes. The American consumer and the Asian producer reaped the benefits. The core of global maritime activity shifted from the North Atlantic to the China Seas. No place would be affected more by these phenomena than the Republic of Korea. Severed by politics from the Asian landmass, South Korea shed its millennial attachments to the continent and began to take on a new global oceanic life. As in effect an island, Korea becomes a maritime nation. And now, of course, as you all know, the ROK is a major presence on the world ocean, emerging as the world's leading shipbuilder and one of the world's top 12 economies, enjoying a success undergirded by oceanic trade and the maritime industries. So, thank you very much.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to be back to CSIS, and I'd like to thank CSIS and the Northeast History Foundation for this opportunity to participate in this seminar. I made sure that what I'm going to say is free of any controversy. But anyway, I try to preface my remarks with just usual caveat that what I'm going to say is purely my own personal perspective on this issue. Since I'm here in CSIS, let me start with a project done by CSIS about 10 years ago. In a book on memory and history in East Asia and Southeast Asia, published by CSIS, year 2000, Gary Gong, who was then senior fellow of CSIS, I guess, argued that the demise of Cold War brought not the end of history, but its resurgence. He predicted that in East Asia, the conflicts about past would shape the future, and that a state was not so much a clash of civilization as a clash of histories, and the battlefield would be the issue of remembering and forgetting. While it is questionable that history has become such a forceful determinant in international relations of East Asia today, as Gary Gong predicted, I think it is true to say that historical issues are now much more salient in both international and national context of East Asia than in the past. While old issues have continued or even exacerbated, new controversies have from time to time broken out to further estrange interstate relations in the region. The salience of historical issues may be attributed to many factors, But one factor which I'd like to address this morning is the human rights laws, international human rights laws and norms, and their influence over historical issues. Let me just briefly explain how international law has evolved with respect to human rights, especially the rise of individual in international law. This phenomenon takes two forms. The first is international protection of individual, and then second, international responsibility of individual. The first phenomenon, this international protection of individual. In the past, how state treats individual, be it its own citizen or foreigner, was largely considered to be domestic affairs of that state. Of course, state's treatment of foreigner often raised sensitive political or legal questions, but generally speaking, the relationship between state and individual was considered to be exclusively domestic affairs of that state. However, this has completely changed through Second World War, and especially this catastrophic experience of Holocaust during Second World War. Now, many people came to realize that human right is obviously too important to be left with the discretion of state. There should be another layer, probably over state, to protect human rights. So these international human rights norms, international human rights laws has emerged since the end of the Second World War. So human rights is protected, of course, by state, but there is an international level to protect human rights. That is international protection of individual. Now it is no longer considered, the state relationship between state and individual is no longer considered to be a domestic affair of that state, but international legal concern. Moreover, an individual has now means, although still rather modest, to enforce its rights under international law and can seek access to remedies available at both international and domestic level. The second phenomenon related to rise of international human rights norms is international responsibility of individual. Again, under traditional international law, definition, regulation, or punishment of crime was again considered to be strictly domestic affairs. However, again, we have seen many cases where those individuals who committed very, very serious crimes were just left unpunished or even protected by state for various reasons. This kind of phenomenon actually made a lot of people to realize that these criminal matters, especially those who committed very serious crimes such as genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, cannot be just left with the state. There should be international responsibility. And now international law directly imposes criminal responsibility on individual with respect to certain category of crimes, including genocide, war crimes, crime against humanity, and so on. And also various international criminal courts and tribunals have been created. And universal jurisdiction have been extended to deal with those who commit those serious international crimes. So this is a second phenomenon related to international human rights law. This emergence of international human rights law and international criminal law maybe perhaps the most important and radical transformation that has taken place to international law in the past 6 decades. I can argue that perhaps the most important international legal developments of the last century, 20th century, is this rise of international human rights law. As I explained, this international human rights law has been in the making for more than 6 decades, starting with the end of the Second World War. However, their impact and influence started to be felt more seriously since 1990s for various reasons. I guess such reasons include, of course, the end of the Cold War, and states now pay more attention to issues such as human rights as this strategic overlay has gone. And also, I would say, transition of various authoritarian regimes, especially in former socialist countries in Eastern Europe and others, into democracies, and the needs for transitional justice, and also atrocities and genocide committed in Bosnia and Rwanda in the 1990s. These have certainly contributed to the upsurge of global attention to human rights. Another important factor in this regard is, I would say, the change of attitude toward international human rights litigation by domestic courts of various countries, in particular domestic courts of this country, United States of America. Starting with this Filatiga versus Pena case of 1980 and Torture Victim Protection Act of 1992, United States domestic courts has become more receptive to international human rights litigations. In fact, this momentous decision of 1980 and legislation of 1992 changed landscape of U.S. court with respect to transnational human rights litigation. Especially in 1995, this Holocaust restitution litigation started in the United States courts. It is really astonishing that U.S. courts were used successfully to deal with wrongs committed over half century ago in foreign country by foreigners. Think about this Holocaust litigation. Holocaust happened in Europe, mostly in Germany and Poland and European countries. This happened more than 6 decades ago. The perpetrators of Holocaust were non-US citizens. Victims of Holocaust were non-US citizens. So United States has perhaps nothing to do with the Holocaust. But this litigation started in United States, and then there was many litigation, Holocaust restitution litigation against foreign companies. And moreover, until 1995, there have been many Holocaust-related litigation, but those lawsuits have been dismissed for various procedural reasons. This Holocaust restitution decision, which started since 1995, not only opened the door to other similar human rights victims to bring claims in the United States, but also contributed to introducing new era of rectifying past and current injustice for the victims and a new standard of international justice for all. I know that there are many who are skeptical of international law. Of course, efficacy of international law is not very high. However, I can say that international human rights law has affected the way state perceives its interests and the way state behaves. In today's world, a state's image and reputations depends to a large extent upon whether and how closely state's conduct conforms to international human rights standards. In particular, international human rights norms have significantly changed the perspective of the international community on various issues related to historical injustices. One can argue that the Holocaust restitution, for example, now serves a global standard and model for reparation claims. One can also argue that legal accountability and material compensation are now necessary, if not sufficient, elements in coming to terms with past injustice and achieving genuine historical reconciliation. Compared to other parts of the world, East Asia has been slow in recognizing this important change in international law and its ramification on the issues related to historical injustice facing the region. Similar lawsuits to Holocaust restitution litigation have been submitted, for example, in the Japanese court, but those lawsuits completely failed. It should be understood, however, that many such issues of history are no longer simply bilateral problems between states concerned. They are human rights issues and global concern. Once again, I'd like to emphasize that think about this Holocaust restitution lawsuits. Again, these are cases that cases that happened a long time ago in foreign territory, perpetrated by foreigners against another foreigners. But still, this case was submitted in the U.S. court, and then decision was made in favor of those victims of terrible atrocities. How a state cope with those issues in these changed circumstances would now, to a substantial degree, shape the image of that state and determine its standing in the world. In particular, the attitude and role of judiciary and the legal community are especially important as they are in better position to grasp those changes and their implication. It has been more than a half century since the most serious forms of injustice and atrocities occurred in East Asia. Generally speaking, the passage of time often obscures the meaning of the conduct and put the past into oblivion. However, it is not the case, at least with respect to human rights violation. They do not simply go away with the passage of time or by the need for forward-looking stance. On the contrary, those human rights violations are continually put into new perspective, and they are judged by ever more stringent criteria as time goes by. Obviously, the role of law, the role of international law in this regard is rather limited in resolving historical issues in East Asia. However, understanding the trend of international legal developments on human rights and its political implication can certainly help find elusive paths toward historical reconciliation in East Asia. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Northeast Asian History Foundation for having me here, particularly as someone who spends a great deal of time looking at Japan. It's always a pleasure to come and talk in a broader regional context, and of course to be on a panel with such thoughtful papers and presenters, and to try and link actually what I think is a quite important insight that the whole conference is attempting to do that we often miss in Washington, if I can say, which is the link between history and policy. And when you're in DC and you're focusing on what's happening today and what's going to happen tomorrow, You don't often think about what happened yesterday, or why it's important, or why it may affect the actions of actors. When you're in the academy, and you're a historian, for example, as I was, looking at history unfolding and attempting to interpret it, you leave it there, and you don't necessarily bring it forward into the present. And I think we would both be served better if we could do that a little more often together, which is try to knit together these two approaches, one intellectual and one policy. And so that's what I'd like to do in just a few minutes today, and very briefly, which is take the bird's eye view, the 30,000-foot view of some of these issues, and hew to the main theme of this panel, which is to look at the historical issues in Northeast Asia, perspectives from law and policy, and I'll leave the law to people who know it, so I'll just deal with history and policy. I would say that in Washington, D.C. in particular, the understanding that history has salience and relevance, particularly in Northeast Asia, is not something new. Policymakers, they get that. They understand it. They intuit it. What they're not able to do necessarily is anticipate how it plays out through the policymaking process. The idea that 60, 70 years after World War II, you would still have issues from that war play an immediate and direct role in relations between not just nations, but three, for example, or four, however you want to count, of the most important nations in Northeast Asia, is something that often perplexes policymakers. It is a constant refrain that trying to grapple with the lessons of history so that we can go forward is something that they just have not yet quite figured out how to do. When departments in Washington, for example, are charged with a specific set of issues, be it economic negotiations, be it political negotiations, human rights negotiations, or the like, the experts that come together have often worked on these issues within a historical perspective that only reaches back through their tenure or briefly before that, perhaps the people who worked before them. So there is, I would actually argue, an almost mistaken sense that the policy process brings into account historical issues. But when you look at the span of history, for example, that Professor Perry talked about, that's not the type of history they're thinking about. They're thinking about history that goes back a very brief period of time. And so what I wanted to try to do, again in a truncated form in this paper, was take it back not as far necessarily as David Kang or Professor Perry, not hundreds of years back, but back around to World War II and work up through the Cold War and attempt to show how the legacies of that period continue to influence the formation of policy, but more importantly, I guess I would call it the evolving trend of relations between the actors. And at least as I thought about it, there seemed to be two major sets of legacies. Obviously, this is all open for debate and interpretation, so I'll look forward to your questions. But one would be the legacies from the colonial and wartime periods, and the second would be the legacies of the Cold War and how they have come together to affect what people today are trying to do both in Northeast Asia and, as I hope to do, give you that perspective from Washington, D.C. Obviously, the major colonial legacy is that of the Japanese imperial experiment from 1895 through 1945, and particularly in Korea from 1910 through 1945. The attendant pain and suffering that was felt by so many in the region that still lives today in societies, again, is something that I would argue policymakers have a particularly difficult time dealing with when you're thinking of how do we rationally solve this problem or that problem. So the legacy of colonialism obviously lives on strongly, the legacy of the war. But within the Northeast Asian context, I would say it also is linked into that broader question of colonization throughout Asia, not just Northeast Asia, but the rest of Asia, sweeping down into Southeast Asia, actually all the way over to India, I think you could make the argument, and intimately tied, of course, with the post-war process of decolonization, of how that played out, the rise of nationalism, the role of the great powers in either helping or hindering a decolonization process, and then responding to the new demands of nationalism throughout the region. Because of the historical nature of the states in Northeast Asia, China, Japan, and Korea in particular, the questions of decolonization were different, primarily, of course, because Japan was the colonizer, not Western nations, but also because those three states were much more successful early on in reconstituting themselves as viable legal political units in the international system, unlike throughout parts of the rest of Asia where the process was much more drawn out. But I think that it's important to at least keep in mind that we don't artificially separate off Northeast Asia from the rest of the region of which it is a part so intimately in trade, in politics, in the flow of people and ideas. The issue of Japan's attempt to grapple, or not grapple, as some would argue, with its wartime guilt, its wartime responsibilities, and own up to what it did, is obviously an issue that continues to play out in Japan. The attempts recently, I think, and certainly I think you could trace some of it back to 1995, the end of the war, the 50th ending of the war, and an attempt by the leadership then and Prime Minister Murayama to really get out an apology that would be accepted, I think has shaped much of what the Japanese government has approached throughout that succeeding period, now a period of 15 years. From that perspective, Japan has attempted to apologize for its past and done so numerous times. But the apology, I don't think that people in Tokyo expect it to stand on its own. Rather, it is linked in the Japanese mind to the role, the good neighbor role, that Japan sees itself playing in the region since the end of the war, both as part of an alliance with the United States, but also independently, through its activities in providing overseas development aid, through providing a part of a security guarantee that is largely underwritten by the United States, through acting as I mentioned, as a good neighbor in many ways, without necessarily answering the direct issues that so many in Asia demand Japan to do. But giving that perspective, I think, is part of the approach, at least from the government side, from a policy side, that also causes the Japanese leadership to be frustrated when what they see as this continual outreach and continual effort on the part of Japan to provide public goods and provide a positive regional role seems to be rejected by so many nations in the region. Obviously, this has hampered tying together Japan and South Korea and Japan and China in closer relations. But I think that the Japanese, as they look back upon this, understand that they are eventually going to have to be much more forthright with the history issue. I think you see that, for example, in some recent attempts by historians in Japan and China to come together over common historical questions and come up with at least a somewhat common framework. The legacy of colonialism, obviously, and the legacy of the war will not go away anytime soon. From the perspective of Washington, I would argue, and of course we have folks here who've been in government and having to deal with it directly, I think that the utility, so to speak, of these legacies that are brought forth at different times, at times of crisis, at times of stress, is something that is seen as non-productive. That there is a separate process that obviously needs to be carried out by nations in the region to address this past, to come to some common set of understanding or acceptance on the part of all sides involved. But that when that is inserted again as a legacy into the policy process, it is something that winds up not only frustrating what is attempting to be done today, but then in essence just hardens those positions that should be dealt with often on a second track, and at least that's my perception of it. So the legacies of the war obviously still there. Second set of legacies that very much color policy today in Northeast Asia, both among the nations of the region as well as from the United States, the legacies of the Cold War. And obviously, again, as a historian, I know that you can't just capriciously separate these off and make demarcating points in time when suddenly we're into the Cold War, or suddenly we're past the Cold War. But when you have an extended historical period of 50 years or so, in which there are a a defining set of issues, in this case that global contest between communism and the liberal West, in which there were different blocs emerging, and in which, from the perspective of Washington, D.C., Asia was a subset of that international contest. Obviously, the patterns of thought, the patterns of action, and very importantly, the institutional structures that were created to navigate through that period that still exist have a continuing influence on policy in what may be, and I would argue, is a very different historical context that is the context of today. The two blocs that developed in Asia as a mirror, a reflection, or a subset of the blocs that developed in Europe shaped the thinking of policymakers and, more importantly, shaped the way that they acted together. For the United States, its position in the region, its ability to be influential, to maintain power and uphold the commitments it had made through legally binding treaties to 5 states in the region, is what we refer to here as the hub and the spoke, the hub being the United States and the spokes radiating out to the countries of Korea, Japan, Philippines, Thailand, and ANZUS, Australia, New Zealand. That's very different from what how we organized and structured our relations with our European partners, in which there was a unified collective security mechanism of NATO, and in which there was a joint acceptance of responsibilities to maintain peace and stability and security, as well as to act to reassert stability if it needed to be. That was very different from the relations in Asia. Because there was no overarching framework during the 40, 50 years of the Cold War, because the United States dealt bilaterally with each of these nations, there was no, I would argue, long-term ability of the United States with its partners, which comprised a large set and certainly the leading liberal nations in the region, to, again, address the overall regional demands and regional conditions from a joint point of view. That there would be a sense of what type of Asia they were, for example, hoping to see in the future or attempting to shape and influence. Rather, it was, again, a bilateral set of approaches. And when Washington had a grand strategy, so to speak, towards Asia, it was intimately tied to that of the broader global Cold War. So when the Cold War ends in 1989, 1990, depending on how you want to put it, there was a very effective, yet also very enduring set of institutional relationships that the United States had, this hub and spoke mechanism. In contradistinction to that, there was a very limited set of pan-Asian institutions, unlike what you saw in Europe. And only with the formation of the ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and its attendant initiatives such as the ASEAN Regional Forum and the like, did Asia begin to move into that same process of thinking jointly as a region. So I would argue that at the end of at the end of the Cold War, there was actually a loss on the part of most nations in the region to think where constructively they were to go forward after this. And certainly I would argue that was the case of the United States. The New World Order, the pause for peace, the peace dividend, whatever you want to call it, that consumed so many here in Washington from basically a budgeting sense, how can we save money from now on, was not translated into a vision for Asia beyond the typical argument that we're interested in prosperity and stability. But history obviously doesn't stand still and doesn't wait for policymakers to determine what the next era is going to be. And at the very moment that you have the end of the Cold War and the end of its active impact on world affairs, but the continuation of its legacies, you also, of course, see the rise of China in the region, which has been both very good and yet very worrisome for many nations in the region. Good, obviously, on the economic side, somewhat undetermined on the political side, and worrisome from the security side. And so it was very easy over the course of the 1990s and into the first decade of this century for the United States to transmute, so to speak, the institutions that it had created to deal with the Cold War, that they should have a living legacy in this new period. And that very much structured the approach, not only of the United States, but the approach of Tokyo, the approach of Seoul, and I would argue the approach of Beijing. So that a set of relationships and a set of common responsibilities that were created for one historical period, albeit a relatively long one in the lifespan of any individual, may not necessarily have been the correct set of institutional relations to guide the region, to guide the nations in the region into a new era. And I think that that legacy itself has caused limitations and, in a way, a feedback mechanism into the approach of not only the United States, but many of its partners in the region. So how does that all then impact policy, what is actually being done in Tokyo, in Seoul, in Beijing, and in Washington? You know, at the most simple level, at the most obvious level, these legacies of both the wartime, the legacies of the Cold War, the institutions that still exist, that we've all attempted to tinker with and make more appropriate to the current situation we're in, I think has hampered the development of closer political relations among the region's main actors. That's not you know, a unique insight. The problem is, I think, how they continue to feed into that process of moving beyond the war and moving beyond the Cold War. The new dynamic in which all the nations of Asia, and in that group I'll put the United States, have attempted to craft a policy towards China has been deeply affected by this. Now, I don't know if it's you know, if it's valid to say, for example, that because we had a mindset throughout the Cold War in which there was one bloc versus another bloc, in which there was an assumption of irreconcilable, and I believe, in fact, there were irreconcilable aims between the two blocs in the Cold War, that necessarily is the appropriate mindset to have in the post-Cold War period and during the rise of China. During the 1990s, I think the United States did attempt to transcend the initial inertia of the Cold War and create a new relationship with China. Certainly you had that even during the Cold War with President Nixon. Yet all of those attempts, for the most part, never reached the fruition that their proponents and their champions hoped. Now, obviously, the deep relations between the United States and China today, or between China and Japan and China and Korea, is probably something that most of those during the Cold War would not have imagined, not only because of the subsequent growth of China, just as an empirical fact, but because of China's own reluctance to be part of the international system during most of the Cold War, choose a third path, be a non-aligned power after the Sino-Soviet split in the mid-1960s. But the growth of China over the past decade, so not during the 1990s, but over the past decade, the choice of Chinese leaders to pursue not only economic growth, which is good for the people of China and good for people in the region and around the world, but also a robust and very complex military buildup, a power projection buildup that has brought them to where they are today, has made it very easy again for the legacies of the past to have new life, and for the thinking and the mindsets of blocs within Asia, or two major blocs within Asia, to have salience. Because the United States maintains those security commitments, because it retains those unique political relationships and responsibilities to Japan and to China, to Japan and to Korea, to the Philippines, and to Australia, it has prevented and hindered, I would argue, a more frank and, quite honestly, innovative approach to thinking how the nations of the region will move forward. The one big difference, obviously, and this is something that I think everyone in Washington, D.C. deals with, the one big difference, for those who want to think of China as the next great threat, it's very hard to reconcile that with their economic role and the dependence the United States has on China. obviously. For those who want to see China as a responsible stakeholder and a country that is going to play a positive and does play a positive role in the world, it's very hard for them to reconcile that with China's military capabilities and the way it's been acting particularly in the past year and in some recent years towards neighbors in the region. No one has come up with that grand strategy yet. You didn't have to in the Cold War, obviously, because the Soviet Union was not an economic concern and not an economic partner, let alone really an economic competitor. So that inability to think innovatively about how to deal with China and from that extend it out to think about a joint, so to speak, Asian approach to the region is one that is unique to this period, but again, I would argue, is influenced by the mindset that we had throughout the Cold War and even before that, when the Japanese Empire and the Japanese imperial moment was spreading throughout Asia of blocks within Asia. Europe has gone beyond that. That is no longer a salient historical legacy in Europe. It is in Asia. And I think that it is something that the current, I would finish up, I think, by saying that the current approach, which has now been ongoing for the better part of 2 decades, for the nations of the region to, first of all, try to come together in some meaningful way, is, I actually think, running out of steam. And secondly, for the nations of the region to continually reach out to China and attempt, in the words of Robert Zellick, to entice it, to encourage it to become a responsible stakeholder, is also running out of steam. That does not mean, and I don't think that necessarily that means we will all be at loggerheads, either with each other or with China. But I do think it means that eventually there's going to have to be a breakthrough in attempting much more forthrightly to decide to put the legacies of the past behind, even if they are unresolved, because it hinders the creation of effective and appropriate policy for today and for the future. How that's done, I don't know. I think people in Tokyo, I know, are thinking about it. Friends that I've talked to in Seoul are thinking about it. And if I had to guess, I think it's going to be an incremental process of starting to move, and I certainly would hope, beyond the hub and spoke arrangement that the United States has, to think more, and to use one of Victor's favorite words, minilaterals, which is 2 or 3 or 4, or beyond 2 actually, so 3 or 4, maybe 5 nations coming together in limited ways to attempt new joint outreach, new joint initiatives, and then potentially spread that beyond the region. But either the big grand visions of Japanese Prime Minister, former Prime Minister Hatoyama, of an East Asian community, I think are unrealistic and overblown. And yet the hub and spoke process itself is one that I think is coming closer to the end of its useful life. So with that, I will welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And our discussant for the panel is Dr. Kim Young-won.
Yes, I'm the last speaker. So before I start to speak, why don't you take a minute to stretch out? So let's take a minute to stretch your arm and legs and shrugging your shoulders. Yes, in a minute. So. Yes. So I will start in a minute. Please be seated. Uh, Good morning, distinguished guests from home and abroad. I am honored to have you here and speak at the opening session. Before I start a comment on the presenter's article, I would like to say my feeling about this place, in Washington, D.C. Many people say that the U.S. is the beacon of freedom. Washington, D.C. is the capital of the U.S., and the place that we stayed overnight yesterday is the Beacon Hotel. So I can say that I'm really in the epicenter of freedom. Now I'm willing to tell my awareness audiences who might wonder why all these people come here and what they try to say. As Plato says in his book, The Statesman, we should take a historical account of the progress of mankind, the progress toward freedom. I believe that even if today's discussion is mainly about issues concerning Northeast Asia, it is not necessarily isolated to one or two countries in the region. Based on this belief, I will speak a couple of things about paper presenters' articles in this opening session, but I ask presenters' kind understanding for my ill-mannered comments in advance. First, Professor David Kang cited Robert Frost with his insightful line, "Good fences make good neighbors." It reminds me of the exclusive economic zone, hereinafter EEZ, the limitation issue between Korea and Japan. Korea and Japan have some maritime delimitation issues concerning sovereign rights in the East Sea, which also called as Sea of Japan. There are also islands, Dokdo, Ulleungdo, and Oki, situated in the center of the sea area. Since the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, hereinafter UNCLOS, came into enforce, it resulted in overlapped areas of EEZ between Korea and Japan in East Sea. This raised the issue of how to delimit these overlapping claims and how to define the line that would be the maritime boundary for the state concerned. They had been in maritime boundary negotiation on a regular basis ever since the effectuation of UNCLOS. However, the negotiations between two countries have been in a predicament because Japan unilaterally notified Korea its plan to conduct hydrographic survey on the Korean side EEZ of East Sea in 2006. The circumstances have become a point of where a compromise must be made. But at a first glance, it seems to relate to maritime jurisdiction issues. However, it is not merely the law of the sea issues, but also historical backgrounds. In 1875, Japan started to creeping jurisdiction with the same cause as a hydrographical survey in the sea area of a Korea island, Kanghwa. It was the so-called modernized Japan's first step towards colonizing Korea. The question Professor Kang asked himself is, how does the past affect the present, and how does the present affect the past? And his conclusion seems to indicate that East Asian countries such as Korea, Vietnam, Japan, etc., try to establish their identities as a modern nation state in the Westphalian system through a positive affirmation of their history. Professor Kang also criticized that East Asian countries try to negate the old East Asian order in a way of emphasizing, glorifying, or degrading different people, events, and actions. I think that it is too harsh to apply his analysis to all the contemporary historical issues in the Northeast Asia. Although I agree with his conclusion that many of the current disputes evolved from historical roots, is to be seen in terms of hegemony, whose side of the story should get told. I disagree with one of his premises that the histories of modern East Asian countries is to be made with rules and institutions from the outside, which means the Westphalian system. The origin of the word history is coming from Greek, historia, meaning inquiry, knowledge acquired by investigation. Forged stories should be distinguished from rigid histories. Second, Professor John Perry's article is so inspiring that it depicts the ocean in various points of view. Among them, he mentioned about the container ship security initiative, in short, CSI, indirectly. And he pointed out that the British did not ask any permission from Korea to land on Korean territory commando in the mid of 19th century. However, I don't agree with the argument that China was nominally in charge of Korean foreign affairs at that time. Third, when I read the article of Professor Chin Yun-Paek, Judge of International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, here in F.I.H. laws, the reasoning behind it is impeccable and undeniable. Professor Paek introduced the development of human rights law since the World War II, getting to the level of imposing international criminal responsibility on individuals. Admitting the international law on offer to resolve historical disputes to be limited, he informed us that we need to reconsider historical reconciliation in the Northeast Asian region in light of development on human rights. Accordingly, I believe that the neighboring states should admit the openness of a moral order that was relational rather than disjunctive. Last not the least, Professor Michael Oslin introduced his survey of the legacies, especially from colonialism from the Cold War. His insight on historical issues and the effect on current policy are not optimistic. What he is emphasizing is Chinese factor. I agree with his argument that the worse Chinese relations gets with the U.S. or its neighbors, the more the old alliance ties are to be fastened in order to maintain stability in the region. We can take a recent case between China and Asian member states in the South China Sea area as an example. However, what I want to emphasize more than anything is the U.S. factor, in a sense that crisis situations would be suspicious of coming more often when the U.S. fails to balance its alliance commitments with a relationship with China. I would like to point out the importance of the U.S. role maintaining stability in the East Asian region. Thus, it is very crucial for the party states concerned to boil their disputes down to a model of international cooperation for the peace and prosperity in East Asia. Peaceful conversation is better than a spiteful confrontation, and mutual agreement are better than legal suit, and friends are better than enemies. Thank you.
Well, thank you to all the panelists and the discussants for some very useful ideas and arguments on the table to start us off. We have a few minutes for questions. We always try to have more time for questions, but when the panels get so large, it gets hard to do that. So I apologize that in advance. If you have a question, just raise your hand and we can get, are we using mics? We can get a mic. Nick has a mic. Nick and Suguk have mics. And if you just identify yourself and then ask your question, try not to give a speech. Okay, so we have a question over here.
Thank you very much. I'm Van Chiang from the Cambodian Institute for Cooperation and Peace. Would like to thank all the panelists for very insightful presentation. My question is, from your own perspective, a historical and legal perspective, how you can manage the conflict over South China Sea? Thank you.
Should we take a couple? Are we answering right now?
Well, all right. Why don't we take a couple of questions and then we'll send it back to the panel. All right. We have Professor Dudden over here,
Hi.
and then right.
Mine actually builds on that question and is either to Professor Kang or Professor Perry, whose papers are wonderfully compatible because I agree that China is going to be the Uber-Westphalian state of the future. How are we to interpret the planting of a Chinese flag on the ocean floor?
Okay, very good. Paul Chamberlain.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Victor, for assembling such an interesting panel. My question is for Judge Peck, and it has to do with human rights abuses in North Korea. If we entertain the notion that someday there would be a unified Korea, peacefully unified Korea, the question inevitably emerges, what should be the approach towards those who are responsible for egregious human rights violations in North Korea? Some people think blanket amnesty would be appropriate in order to facilitate the establishment of a new society, and others think retribution is more appropriate. What are your thoughts?
Okay, and then we had another question here. Yes.
Thank you very much for all the panelists. And my question is mainly for Dr. Michael Oslin, but maybe for other panelists. My question is that since the topic of this panel is about history, we all know that the current issues of the East Asia mainly caused by historical issues or legacies. And my question to you is that how can we manage the current conflicts on the basis of the status quo, especially before we settle all the historical issues. And I think most of the historical issues cannot be completely settled because as we know that, for example, Japan has no sincerely apologized about his history. So what I mean is that in this situation, how can we manage the current conflicts, for example, in the Yellow Sea, the Diaoyu Island, and the territorial disputes in the East Asia? Thank you.
Okay, that's. I think that's a good way to start us off. So, several questions on the table. Who would like to start? Judge Peck, would you like to start?
Yes, sir. I have answer to the first question, conflict over South China Sea. Those states concerned try to resolve this conflict through peaceful means, through negotiation. But if they are unable to do so, please submit this dispute to the International Tribunal for the Laws. We are ready to. We are pleased and ready to deal with this kind of case. So that's the answer to. This is serious answer, really. The first question, and then another question to me about human rights abuse in North Korea. I think this is a very good question. I'm sure this question is at the back of head of many Koreans who think about the future of Korean Peninsula and what we are going to do with this question. I've been thinking about this for some time. Obviously, it's a very difficult question. Whether prosecution would be the answer, or Truth Commission or Reconciliation Commission, just like in South Africa or other countries around the world, that would be a better approach, or amnesty. Samuel Huntington wrote in his book on third wave about this transitional justice, and he argued that regarding this past injustice and atrocity, usually balance of power determines the way this past injustice is dealt with. Balance of power between outgoing power and incoming power. So even if, say, we have certain preference, that preference may not prevail. Obviously, a lot depends on the way Korean unification is achieved, and international forces as well as domestic political forces and so on. But so I have no specific answer to your question, but one thing I can say, in light of what I said in my presentation, human rights is such a prominent international and global concern these days. And we know that a lot of atrocity has happened and is happening in North Korea. And we simply cannot turn our back on what happened in North Korea, especially as far as human rights abuse are concerned. So I think there should be a certain way to deal with this issue in the future. I don't know what is the best approach to deal with this issue. I don't know. Again, I can't answer, whether prosecution is the best approach or other alternatives should be sought. But those who committed those abuses should be held accountable. That's all I can say. Thank you.
I'll try and answer those first two very briefly, which is I don't have any answer for the South China Seas or the China flag, but I think in terms of what will make it worse or better is whether it depends on, is it really about interests or is it about identities? And what I mean there is we tend to think of the South China Sea or even Dokdo as things about like oil or fish or something. And if that's the case, I actually think it'll be far easier to resolve, particularly because you can divide it up, you can make side deals, et cetera, et cetera. But if this has to do with things like national identity and sovereignty, I think it'll be a lot harder to solve. And my sense is that Dokdo is about sovereignty, and nobody really thinks it's a military or economic advantage to have the islands. It's about who that belongs to. And the South China Seas, I don't know yet. I don't think it's as much about identity, and what would be very interesting is if they don't find any oil there. Then I'd be very interested to see if people still try and claim it or not. But if it is about oil, then I think it's easier to solve than if these various 12 countries that have claims think that it's part of their national sovereignty.
And may I?
Please.
I would say that the flag issue may have been triggered by a similar gesture on the part of the Russians in 2007 when a Russian oceanographic expedition dropped a flag on the floor of the Arctic, although there the stakes, of course, are much higher, presumably, than they are in the South China Sea. But could I segue into something else? I'm thinking about history, and history, after all, is about memory, and memory is very elusive, and for people of a certain age, particularly so, like me. Anyway, I remember my late father-in-law in his mid-90s saying to me, "John, why is it I can remember the mathematical concept of pi out to 17 places, but not why I went upstairs?" Now, memory is also selective, and I think our central theme here is all about defining the past, and using the past productively, I think, presents an opportunity. And here, although it's outside our area, I would like to cite the case of Singapore. Singapore. If you've been to Singapore, you know the ubiquitousness of the Raffles name. Even Singapore Airlines names its business class after Sir Stamford Raffles. It's Raffles class. Raffles is a symbol of course, of the British imperial, colonial past. And you don't find South African Airways calling its business class Rhodes class. But the Singaporeans, in shaping a new state in 1965, chose to use the British imperial past in a productive way. They forgot the evil parts of colonialism, of which there are many, but they saw in the British colonial experience a tradition of dignity, power, stability, very attractive to a very uncertain new state. And so instead of rejecting and excoriating the British and the past, they embraced it. Secondly, in World War II, Singapore experienced a bitter occupation by the Japanese. And they were particularly cruel to the Chinese residents of Singapore. But after the war and the independence of Singapore, Singapore's leaders turned to Japan for economic assistance and advice, inviting multinational corporations to come to the island state to help in the development of an export-driven economy. This was an export strategy for survival. So the past was forgotten in favor of the value of a pragmatic approach. And a third instance would be attitudes towards communism, particularly Chinese communism, which was very threatening to the first years of Singapore and very much in the mind of Lee Kuan Yew and the other leaders. Yet in 1990, Singapore recognized China diplomatically and has had close relationships ever since, investing in China, for example. And Lee Kuan Yew, in his autobiography, comments that of all the world statesmen he ever met, and he met almost everyone of eminence of his time, he said Deng Xiaoping was by far the greatest. So perhaps this is an example for us of using the past productively, forgetting the horrors of it, and looking to whatever might be found that's positive.
I'd like to try to answer the South China Sea questions, but to add on or maybe differ a little bit from what David King said. I don't think it's a matter of just identity or interest. It's a matter of influence. It's a matter of being able to shape the region. So in terms of South China Sea, and I'm going to keep it to South China Sea, not Dokdo, which is a different set of issues. But in terms of South China Sea, it's not just, and we'll, the truth is we're going to do to the flag of the Chinese what we did to the flag of the Russians. We're going to ignore it, and we already are. It has no meaning because your influence is determined and based on what you can actually do. So technically, yeah, they could get a sub down there, a little submersible, and drop a flag down. It has no other meaning than that. But the influence that China is attempting to exert in the region, particularly on these territorial issues and the way that they want to resolve them bilaterally, each set of issues over the Spratlys, over the Parasols, and the like, is something that goes, I think, beyond identity, and it goes beyond sheer interests. Also, David, just briefly on the oil issue, in the South China Sea this summer, a Chinese, one of the scientific institutes discovered something like 200 different oil fields that they had identified and parcels. Can you get to them? No. You know, will it happen in our lifetimes? Maybe not. But that issue, I think, is coming into play, especially when you look at the way that undersea infrastructure is developing. And precisely because if they can send a sub all the way down to the bottom of the South China Sea, you know, that's one step more in capabilities to ultimately get what's there, which is not only oil, it's rare earth minerals, it's crust materials, and the like. So there's a lot down there. The question, obviously, you know, if we had an answer to how do you manage relations between China and the Southeast Asian nations, you know, you'd have it, and Washington would have figured it out. What I would say is that the recent position taken by the administration and by Secretary of State Clinton, which she rolled out, so to speak, at the ASEAN Regional Forum in Vietnam a few months ago, is one that, whether right or wrong, and I'll come down and say I think it's the right thing to do, but whether you think it's right or wrong, I think just reifies what I was talking about. It has created a block mentality. Now, you can say that's, you know, that's not our fault. China created the same type of block mentality by refusing the entreaties of Southeast Asian nations to deal with this collectively, and that was the push. The United States has now weighed in and said we consider it, if China considers Southeast Asians, South China Sea to be a core interest, Secretary Clinton said it is now a national interest, in the national interest of the United States to resolve this, but resolve it in a multilateral mechanism. Well, that can only result in two blocks. China on the one hand, which is the defendant, I guess, in all of this, and the other nations of the region, including the United States, which is the plaintiff. Now, the ability of the United States actually to get that done is something, you know, I have great skepticism about, even though I think it's the right thing to do, because it goes back to that question of influence. You're laying down markers, and you are either upholding or establishing norms of behavior, in this case, norms of international behavior. Now, some of those norms are going to become legal, and Judge Peck will be dealing with them and already deals with them. That's the way that some norms are dealt with. Other norms are simply dependent on the power balance at the time. And so the role of the United States in being an ultimate guarantor, or at least interpreted as an ultimate guarantor of stability, is one that remains important. Now, if you are the administration and you have, so to speak, stuck your chin out on this issue, you know, you better be able to back it up, or you're going to lose an enormous amount of credibility in the region over having inserted yourself into the issue, but not being able to back up your words. And then just very briefly to wrap up, the question was, how can you manage current conflicts? If I got your question right, how do you manage current conflicts on the basis of the status quo and the like? And you brought up Yellow Sea, you brought up territorial disputes. Well, you know, each one is different. It depends what you want to do. There's not one size fits all approach, obviously. That's where the utility of the hub and spoke organization, whatever, the hub and spoke relationships actually still exist. That we have working relationships with China, with Japan. We have a working relationship with China, but not an alliance relationship. You know, we have a working alliance relationship with South Korea. We have it with Japan. We have it with other nations that we leverage to respond to any of the issues. Now, so I think part of the answer to your question is you start with those working relationships, but you don't limit it there. You create new working relationships. The United States has been involved in trilateral dialogues between itself and Japan and South Korea, between itself and Japan and Australia. I think it's time for those to become a little bit more effective. But it would have been nice, for example, you brought up the LOC specifically, if the United States and South Korea hadn't done it just bilaterally, you know, ostensibly in response to the sinking of the Cheonan by North Korea. China decided to weigh in on that issue immediately and say, no, you know, don't bring the aircraft carrier in and the like. I think it would have been more effective not only if we hadn't waited several months, but if we had expanded the set of activities we were going to do to bring in our major naval partner in the region, which is Japan. So that's the type of set of working relationships based off of this hub and spoke that I think we can at least consider. I'm not saying you scrap everything, and you know there's going to be pushback at different points, but you have to think innovatively about it.
All right, Victor had to go teach. He's still a professor, so he left me in charge. We'll shamble. He'll come back. The place will be chairs overturned. We have a couple minutes left, so why don't we take one or two more questions before lunch, and then we'll have maybe a quick response. Is there anybody who has? I see a hand over there, and then one here, and we'll.
Hi, my name is Shane Graves from the U.S. Korea Institute, and my question is for Professor Aslan. We're talking today about improving Northeast Asian relations. And I'd like for you to elaborate on why you feel Hatoyama's vision of an East Asian community was unrealistic. Is it merely the size that he envisioned in connection with the difficulty in overcoming historical issues? Or I wonder if it's more related to the U.S. presence in such an organization. Because following up on your argument, does a greater U.S. presence in some sort of future East Asian version of the EU constrain East Asian relations and cooperation? And what do you feel is the appropriate role for the U.S. in such a future community if it's to succeed?
Thank you. I'll try to be brief.
Hang on. Let's get the other one, and then we'll go. Yes.
Hello, my name is Grace, and I am a student at the George Washington University, and I hope that you'll permit me two quick questions, one of a historical nature and one more policy-based. Dr. Khan, when you were speaking of the change in conceptualizing international relations in Asia, I was wondering how much of that was based on adopting these new Western norms in IR theory, and how much of that was based on the current events and trying to distance themselves from a weaker and unstable China. And my other question I'd like to open up to the entire panel. In speaking of trying to come up with new and innovative approaches to international relations, as Dr. Austin was saying, what can we do beyond the hub and spoke? And I'd be curious as to what you gentlemen individually would think would be the best approach to this. Thank you very much.
Great. All right. How about we'll start with Mike and.
Thanks. Again, it's a very good question, important question. There is a Pan-Asian organization based off of ASEAN called the East Asian Summit, which has been relatively limited and unsuccessful in really transforming things. You also have the ASEAN Regional Forum, but that is more focused on security issues. You don't have something that really is 360 degrees, both in terms of the participants as well as the issue set that's involved. And the U.S. is not a part of the East Asian Summit. The East Asian Summit came out of ASEAN and what was known as the ASEAN +3 process, China, Korea, Japan, and then it became a +6 process. And at the, I thought, somewhat aggressive in a good sense, insistence of Japan that India, Australia, and New Zealand be brought into the process to provide a more of a democratic counterweight to China within what was envisioned as this ASEAN +3 or +3+. The U.S. chose not to take part in it, and despite the interests of some of the nations involved, including Japan, Singapore, and others, to have us involved. But there are others here who know more about what happened in that period, and so I'll leave it at that. Does the U.S. hinder a community like that? And I'll get to the EAC in a second. Does it hinder a community like that? I mean, I don't know. We are one of the guiding forces behind APEC, and APEC's been going on for 20 years. A lot of criticism as to what it's actually achieved, but we're part of it. We're part of the ASEAN Regional Forum. We're part of the Shangri-La Dialogue. So I don't think the presence of the U.S. hinders it, but it depends what you want to do. Again, if what you're trying to ultimately see is a indigenous, so to speak, Asian multilateral organization that deals with all the issues of the region, then it has to come not from, this is not 1947, and we're not creating NATO. And we're not creating, the UN and the like. So I think it has to come from the region. The big point to wrap up about Hatoyama and the East Asian community, I guess I'm just, again, as an historian, a realist in the sense of, I think when things happen is when they happen. You can't really push them along, or you have to have such punctuation points like 1945 to 1949 that you can reshape the international environment at will. And we don't have that, and quite frankly, I don't think we want another 1945 to 1949 period because it came after 1937 to 1945. So we don't want to have that just because we can create all these elegant institutions to guide international affairs. Let's not forget, speaking of historical legacies, why we have the UN, the IMF, Bretton Woods, ASEAN, CEDAW, NATO, and all the other things. So I just think that, when you have a national leader come out and say, well, we're going to create a new international organization by fiat, and it's going to have some relevance and salience, it's wonderful aspirationally. But if it were such a good and something of such value, my belief is it would already be there. It would have happened. Maybe not in its fully formed, way, but it would have eventually come to that. So I'm just more skeptical of attempts like that to create something out of fiat. And the ASEAN process itself is proof of that because it's been very, very slow and very gradual. And it may have more ability to actually ultimately reshape things than these grand aspirational approaches.
Dr. Peck, do you have anything?
I don't have much to add, but one thing I'd like to say about this Asian regional order, hub and spokes used to be a very powerful frame to describe the Asian regional order, especially Asian security order. But I think, of course, the hub and spoke is still relevant, at least with respect to the security arrangement prevailing in Asia. But now, Asian regional order is much more complex than this, as has been said by my colleague here. We have a lot of Asian gatherings, Asian forums to talk about the various issues related to economy as well as security of Asian region. So I don't know exactly how to describe Asian regional order, but it has many layers, a multi-layer kind of order. At the bottom, in security areas, of course, there is still hub and spokes arrangement. But in other, there are many other layers where different forums or gatherings are more pertinent. One more thing I'd like to add is for the past 10 years, especially since the 9/11, United States focus, especially U.S. This occupation with war on terrorism. United States did not pay much attention to East Asia. United States strategic focus was on Central Asia as well as Middle East, but then with the Obama administration, United States seems to be back to Asia. I don't know how to interpret this move, but I think it is a welcoming change in U.S. Policy that the United States now pay more attention to Asia, and I think it will be a constructive factor in exploring better regional order in East Asia. Okay.
I would just say my colleagues have spoken very eloquently on this issue. I would simply add that the North Pacific region is conspicuous for its lack of cohesion in an organizational sense, and this is not without reason.
All right, I have the last word. I will be. No, I'll talk to you after when we're done. So lunch is going to be in the room where Kat is. Raise her hand behind there. Thank you, everyone. I think this has been a wonderful panel. I look forward to more. Thank you very much.